Very good afternoon to all. So next, we would be starting with our instruction course on ocular and adnexal tumors, guide to diagnosis. So ocular and adnexal tumors have always eluded many of us, and they continue to do so. As in any cancer of any part of the body, early diagnosis is always the key for better organ as well as life salvageability. So without further ado, we'll start with our instruction course, where we have very eminent and experienced speakers talking to us about different variety of ocular as well as adnexal tumors, the highlight being our joining us to give us very essential pointers from a pathologist point of view in treating ocular oncology cases. To start with, I will invite Dr. Aditi Vatve to start with her presentation. She'll be talking about the red flags not to be missed in case of eyelid tumors. Dr. Aditi, over to you.
Yeah, sure. Good afternoon or evening to all. Am I audible and is my screen visible?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, Aditi.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Hello all. So I shall be sharing and discussing with you about the picking up the red flags in the eyelid tumors. So we'll start basically with this case. This elderly lady came to me with complaints of irritation of the right upper eye with pricking sensation. On detailed clinical examination, there was a small nodular whitish thing which was present in the upper eyelid. On a magnified view, it turned out to be a small nodule which was not very good for her and turned out to be a sebaceous gland carcinoma on clinical examination. So why was the sebaceous gland carcinoma suspected? So coming to the SGC, which is the most common eyelid tumor in Indian subcontinent. So when do we actually suspect SGC? It's basically rounding of lid margins, loss of lashes. Loss of lashes is a feature which is common for almost all the eyelid malignancies. Telangiectasia, or very dilated feeder vessels coming to the mass, and effacement of meibomian gland orifices. These are the four main pointers which need to be considered when examining any eyelid mass. So most of the SGCs many a times will present as a lid mass in different sizes, morphologies. But if we try and pick up those lesions at this stage, it will definitely be very good for the patients as well as for us to manage the disease. These kind of lid masses, it is very important to remember that we evert the eyelid and see the lesion, which will give clue towards the diagnosis as well as give a clue towards the extent of the lesion, the actual extent of the lesion, because sometimes if we do not evert it, we may underestimate the size of the lesion. Another common lid mass which is present is a chalazion, which is a painless mass, which is generally inflammatory lesion, non-infective inflammatory lesion, which is also a common presentation of SGC. We need to keep in mind that even in these chalazia, inversion of the eyelid will give us a clue, as well as we need to know the history, if there has been any history of recurrent chalazion at the same site with history of repeated INC. So as we can see in this patient, the loss of lashes as well as the scar of the previous INC will give a clue towards the mass being some kind of lid malignancy. Most of the times it is sebaceous gland carcinoma. So when these kind of lesions which look like a giant chalazia, what we need to see is if the lesion is extending beyond the tarsal plate, it generally points towards the eyelid malignancy rather than a chalazion. So similar lesion which is extending beyond the tarsal plate, having good nice feeder vessels towards the growing towards the mass, and obviously the eversion is giving a very good clue towards the diagnosis. Again, unilateral blepharitis, which is not resolving for a long time in spite of best possible medical management, we should consider it as a masquerade of like SGC and plan an incision biopsy, and then we can plan a definitive surgery according to the histopathological report. So this patient interestingly came to me for entropion correction. She had undergone laser lash removal for the recurrent lashes which were rubbing towards the on the globe, and the eversion did not give a very healthy picture. So we did an incision biopsy, which turned out to be actually SGC, which was giving rise to misdirected lashes. And this was missed for a long time. So it had spread for a long distance. So she had to undergo extensive surgery followed by reconstruction. Thankfully, she is doing well. These kind of unilateral blepharoconjunctivitis cases, with large, very red, angry looking conjunctiva, we need to keep the pagetoid spread of the SGC in mind. As we know, SGC cells generally try to attract the inflammatory cells. So most of the times the lesion or mass and surrounding conjunctiva may be inflamed, as well as the pagetoid spread may be present. So how do we diagnose it? By doing map biopsy, where we take the small biopsies from both the tarsal conjunctiva 3 sides, fornical conjunctiva upper and lower 3 sides, the bulbar conjunctiva, as well as the caruncle, which will actually map our lesion and will help in finalizing the treatment plan. So what are the red flags in prognosis, from prognosis point of view? These were the red flags from diagnosis point of view. These are from prognosis point of view. Clinically, what we need to know is involvement of both lids, multicentric origin, duration of symptoms more than 6 months, lesion more than 10 millimeters, and pagetoid spread generally indicate a bad prognosis. So coming to basal cell carcinoma, which is another common lid malignancy, which can be the most common types are nodular or nodular ulcerative, which are generally diagnosed, but sometimes they are also missed, considering it as a non-healing eyelid wound. So these are pigmented lesions, may present with some ulcerations. It can present on either of the eyelids. The more common lesion which is missed, but it is like the presentation is less common, but it is more commonly missed, is morphiiform or sclerosing BCC. Here there is no mass as such. It is a flat lesion, pearly white with not very well-defined margins. So it is most commonly missed. These kind of lesions, which can be referred as a entropion case, but on examination you can actually see the pigmented lesion. It is a kind of pigmented with morphiiform lesion. Even it can be referred as ectropion case, which actually the lid is pulled down because of the sclerosing part of the BCC. So why do we need to diagnose them early? Making reconstruction easy and cosmetically more acceptable is very important in this era. It also decreases the morbidity as well as decreases the chances of metastasis and overall life prognosis. So if we actually diagnose the lesion at this stage, it gives very good cosmesis, and even on eye closure you cannot see where the excision was performed. Similar is the case with small chalasia like lesion, where it gives a very good clinical outcome. So these kind of BCCs also, when diagnosed in time, give a very good cosmesis. Only thing which is missing generally is the lashed part. But if we make the BCC grow to a very big size, it makes a very large defect on table, which makes the reconstruction very complex. Also, in spite of such a complex reconstruction, the cosmesis will be acceptable, but not as good as the ones when we can detect it very early. These kind of morphiiform lesions, we need to keep in mind that the clinical extent might be much more than the actual extent which can be found out on frozen section. It is always important to send the specimen for frozen section to know the margin clearance, so that we can start the reconstruction on the same day or in the same sitting. So with the important thing about these morphia form are they generally do not go very deep. They go horizontally over the lid margin. So the vertical extent need not be excised at a bigger stage, and then it gives a very good cosmetic outcome. So it is better to avoid these extensive lesions so that the morbidity which comes from the extensive surgeries and neoadjuvant chemo or adjuvant treatment comes down, and even cosmesis will be slightly better if you avoid this stage. So what is the take home message? Early diagnosis, remembering the clinical red flags is very important to have the early diagnosis. Always keep masquerades in mind. Something which is not resolving with a common treatment, keep malignancy as one of the DDs. It is always better to do incision biopsy than missing any malignancy. Anticipate the defect and keep reconstruction plan A as well as plan B ready, because sometimes frozen section clearance may surprise you with the amount of defect which can be seen on the table. So these are the points which will help to avoid delay in diagnosis. High index of clinical suspicion, sending chalazion for HP if you are finding a firm mass or solid thing which is coming out of the chalazion while doing INC. Low threshold for biopsy. Always do map biopsy when needed. It is very important to communicate with the pathologist to know the orientation as well as margin as well as base clearance. Send the specifications and talk to the pathologist while sending the specimen. Thank you.
Thank you, Aditi, for a very crisp and illustrative presentation. That was inclusive of all the red flags that we wanted to point out. Next, moving from eyelids, we'll go on to the orbit, how to identify the orbital tumors. And using the orbital tumors, we have our young and dynamic presentator, Dr. Swapnil Patil. He'll be filling in for Dr. Mangesh Zobekar. Sir, Dr. Swapnil is a practicing oculoplasty surgeon.
Okay. Am I audible, ma'am?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah.
Hi, Dr. Sonal and team. Thank you for this lovely course and all the
Hello.
best and congratulations.
Thank you.
Hello, Dr. Ragini, madam.
Hello. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much. Hi, thank you so much.
Hello, ma'am. Okay, I'll start with my presentation, orbital tumors, whether native or guest. I'm presenting on behalf of Dr. Mangesh Zobekar, sir. We all know that orbit is a Pandora's box. So I'll start with that. Whenever a patient came to our OPD with bilateral orbital lesions or unilateral orbital lesion or a proptosis, we should ask certain set of questions to us. What it is, whether it is neoplasm or whether this is a simulating lesion, or whether it is a benign lesion or a malignant lesion, where it is intraocular, intraconal or extraconal, and what is the extent and relation to optic nerve, muscle and apex of the orbit. So with this set of questions, we can frame some differential diagnosis and can go ahead with certain investigations such as USG abdomen, your CT, MRI of orbit and everything. Then we should frame some management, that is surgical, medical or observation, and further complication and outcomes. A stepwise approach is most important. So a brief of history and clinical examination, 6 P's are important. Whether the orbital mass is associated with pain, how is the progression, that is the onset, it is acute, subacute or chronic, or rapid, slow or indolent, and proptosis measurement, axial as well as abaxial proptosis, that is the globe displacement should be measured. Palpatory findings are at most important, pulsation should be looked for, and everybody should look for periorbital changes. A well-documented visual acuity and color vision is mandatory. Pupils should be measured, and Sherman's test is important in lacrimal gland tumor. Basic ocular examination, important cranial nerve examination, and oral and nasal examination is also very important. Orbital tumor are classified as primary, secondary, or metastatic. Can be intraconal or extraconal classification. The most important classification is pathological, that is cyst, vascular, inflammatory, neurogenic, lacrimal. Inflammations. Orbital is more common in infants. They are congenital choriostomas of orbit. These are entrapment of the epithelial cells by closure of the suture lining. The CD shows a well-defined circumscribed lesion with hyperdense wall and hyperdense content. They can be well managed with excision biopsy. Many times there are concealed orbital lesions, concealed orbital dermoid. This is a 25-year-old female patient came with upper lid.
Swapnil, are you online? I think. Do you want to reshare your slides?
You have to unmute yourself, Dr. Swapnil.
Yeah, is it visible, ma'am, now?
Yes, it's visible. You can go ahead.
Okay. These orbital teratomas are unilateral proptosis at birth, which are rapidly progressive, globe compression, corneal exposure, as well as visual loss. Orbital teratomas are orbital teratoma. They can prompt diagnosis and early surgery for better outcome, and exenteration in advanced cases is mandatory. Orbital congenital cystic eye. Wait a minute, ma'am. Yeah, am I audible, ma'am?
Yes, you are audible.
Sorry, ma'am, for the age. Orbital congenital cystic eyes. It is a rare benign orbital lesion that results from failure of invagination of primary optic vesicles. Here we can see in the CT scan there is absence of globe and a cyst is there in the orbital area. They can be well managed by cyst aspiration with sclerotherapy and with good cosmetic outcome. Many times there are simple cysts of conjunctival origin which can be addressed with excision biopsy with beautiful results. Now this is a 10-year-old male patient came to our OPD with complaint of mild proptosis, pain and limitation of extraocular muscle in superior gaze. CT scan was done which shows a well-defined hypointense lesion with surrounding inflammation suggestive of a colex. He was diagnosed to have an orbital cysticercosis. It is a parasitic infection caused by Taenia solium. It can be orbital, ocular, or neurocysticercosis. Such patients can present with pain, redness, periocular swelling, can present as a orbital cellulitis and proptosis. In addition, patient with neurocysticercosis can have seizures and epilepsy attacks also. They can be managed with oral albendazole with tapering dose of steroid. Coming to orbital vascular regions, they are classified as no flow, venous flow, or arterial flow. No flow consists of lymphangiomas, venous flow consists of capillary hemangioma, and arterial flow are AV malformations. Orbital lymphangiomas or lymphatic malformations can be congenital, can be acquired. They can be multicystic. They are multicystic and localized. They are classified on the basis of cyst size, most commonly as a cyst size that is microcystic, and mixed. They are present as a gradually painless proptosis and ptosis. Many a times the proptosis can be rapidly progressive in case of intraorbital hemorrhage. CT scan show multicystic fluid on fluid and air on fluid levels can be seen. There is no complete cure. Recurrences are common. However, surgical debulking or cyst aspiration with sclerotherapy with bleomycin is a treatment of choice. This is again orbital lymphangioma in older patients. Now coming to orbital capillary hemangioma. Generally, they are present in less than 6 months of age. Here we can see there is well enhancement on the CT scan. The main concerns are amblyopia and strabismus at such young age. Oral and topical beta blocker therapy can show good resolution in such children. Many a times intraretinal triamcinolone also shows good resolution, but at a certain cost of may have side effects such as subcutaneous eyelid depigmentation or eyelid necrosis. If there is no risk of amblyopia or strabismus, we can wait for spontaneous resolution. Now coming to cavernous hemangiomas, which are slowly progressive vascular.
I think there is some issue again.
Sonal, do you want to jump to the next one and then come back to him when he's okay?
Yes. All right. If Sumit is online, Swapnil will come back to you. You can, then just complete the presentation and summarize, right? We'll go ahead with the next talk, and till then we'll figure out the technical issues going on. Next, I'll invite Dr. Sumit Lahane. Sumit needs no introduction. He's currently working as an assistant professor at GMC Mumbai and JJ Group of Hospitals. He'll be talking to us about the ocular surface tumors, what the different colors mean. Over to you, Sumit.
Are my slides visible?
Yes,
hope-
go ahead.
So thank you so much, Sonal, for giving me an opportunity with the IC, and it's an honor, always a pleasure to present with the Kaustubh sir. And when we were discussing that we need to cover ocular surface tumor as one of the important tumor, we realized that it could be a different IC altogether to talk on ocular surface tumors. So I will be covering major tumors which we see in a day-to-day OPD. So to classify ocular surface tumor, there is an area of classification. You classify it as epithelial, stromal, caruncular. Again, you classify it as a non-melanocytic, melanocytic, and it will be a very difficult to talk about all these tumors. So let's go with the case example. So this is just a 25-year-old male presenting to the OPD with the complaint that there is increasing in the black pigment on my eye, and worried about that what this could be. The other major concern is cosmetic. Now, how do you exactly tell this patient that he need not worry about this lesion and he can go home safely and this is not going to harm him at all? So basically, you can see properly there are various colors in this lesion. There are dark brown, there is black, there is faint brown, and then once you do OCT, you see multiple cysts over here. Another thing that you see is there is change in the color and it is involving somewhere near the caruncle also. Now, when do you see this lesion, which is away from the limbus, involving a caruncle? There are no cysts seen, and it's a darkly pigmented lesion. A lesion which is away from the limbus, involving caruncle without cyst and a darkly pigmented lesion, this is nothing but a red flag sign, and it is very difficult to resect clear margin in this tumor. Now, the calculation goes in your mind that what to do with such cases and what is this we are looking at. So you should know that what we are looking at is nothing but a conjunctival nevus. Conjunctival nevus ideally presents in the interpalpebral area. It has a feeder vessel. It has a clear cyst, which I had shown in the OCT picture. Nevus does grow in the size in the children during puberty, pregnancy, and sun exposure. There is intrinsic vascularity present, and there is variable pigmentation present. So all these are very much telltale sign that what are you looking at, the benign nevus, and you need not worry about it, and it does not encroach on the cornea. Anything other than this, mark my words, anything other than this, what you are looking at, the atypical nevus. Now see, this is again, you see a darkly pigmented lesion, which is near the limbus, but it is encroaching on the cornea. It is darkly pigmented and there are no cysts seen. So this is basically you're seeing is a conjunctival melanoma and not the nevus. This is something that you should be worried about. In an elderly person, a thicker base, lacking cyst and a hemorrhagic thing and a darkly pigmented lesion is what you're looking at is a melanoma. Origin of the melanoma, though it is only 20% of the cases are from nevus, but it can happen especially in the large nevus. So you need to be very much observant about the same. The question comes as to be or not to be, and when do you remove the nevus? So there are certain indications when you want to remove the nevus. You see a lesion without cyst, a larger more than 1 centimeter lesion, a dark uniform pigmentation, and a corneal epithelial invasion more than 3 clock hours are very much indications that you can go ahead with the biopsy of the lesion. Now, once you see this lesion, and as I saw, do the incision biopsy here, and then we go ahead with the excision biopsy because it does show certain features of melanoma. Now, the black lesions are multiple ones from the nevus to racial melanosis. We'll just look with each slide each. Now, once you see this kind of a lesion, especially in the rural population, what do you see is there is variable pigmentation. It's more concentrated at the limbus, 360-degree, and most important, it is bilateral. What are you looking at is nothing but a completion-related conjunctival pigmentation. You see this kind of a patient, especially child presenting to you, no conjunctival pigment, parents bothered about the pigmentation seen. This is basically a UVL and the episcleral pigment, but it does impart a risk of development of melanoma 1 in 400. You should see in such cases for palatal and the hairline pigmentation. What you are looking at is nothing but a congenital ocular melanosis, a benign condition as such, but associated with the UL melanoma in a risk of 1 in a 400. So warrants a yearly examination in such cases. Now, this lesion is primary acquired melanosis, now known as the intraepithelial melanocytic proliferation. It manifests in the middle age. It is not present since birth or early in the age. It's unilateral, superficial, solitary. It can present anywhere, bulbal, fornicer, or the palpebral conjunctiva, and it could be patchy, diffuse, or the multifocal. What are you looking at is nothing but an intraepithelial melanocytic proliferation. And if you remember a slide before of a melanoma, 70% of the melanomas arise from the intraepithelial melanocytic proliferation. So out of all the black lesions other than melanoma, you should be worried about is this, which is IMP or the PAM, the old etiology. So point to retain here is the conjunctival nevus is the most common pigmented lesion. All nevi need not be excised. PAM should be closely monitored, and adequate use of imaging and collaboration with the pathologist is very important. Now, when we talk about white lesions, this is one of my favorite slides where you see 3 lesions looking just sequel of each other, basically. But here, what are you looking at is actinic keratosis, pseudoepitheliomatous hyperplasia, and the OSSN. You need to able to differentiate them just because their management is completely different from each other. Congenital pseudoepitheliomatous hyperplasia is basically a reactive inflammatory thing. Many times patient does give history of any surgery like pterygium or the foreign body entry or the allergic conjunctivitis. Complete excision, additional cryotherapy would constitute the optimal management, but it can be very well observed too. Actinic keratosis, the pre-malignant condition, it is generally clinically indistinguishable from the conjunctival intraepithelial neoplasia. It's basically a relative indication for surgical excision and the supplemental cryotherapy, and it should be very closely monitored, especially in the cases who have a lot of exposure to the ultraviolet light. Now here I don't have to tell you that what are we looking at a neoplastic lesion. What I'm trying to show is basically a feeder vessel, or rose Bengal stain positive, growth or cornea, presence of keratin. And all these features are basically indicators that what you are looking at is the ocular surface squamous neoplasia. However, lesion might be small or the large, most of these features are basically red flag signs that what are you looking at the ocular surface squamous neoplasia. There are various varieties and there are changes as per the clinical features are different as you see, but you need to see for the feeder vessels and the keratin in each lesion. What I can suggest to all the general ophthalmologists, whenever they see any suspicious lesion, it is always advisable to stain it with the rose Bengal, see it after a minute and look for the keratin purposely. Now in the red lesions, very commonly what we see is epithelial inclusion cyst. It could be congenital or acquired, and they can be either observed and increasing in size for the cosmetic purpose. They can undergo excision. Excision is always ideal in such cases, and never do a puncture of the cyst or the aspiration of the cyst because they do reoccur very commonly in such cases. And such kind of lesion though looks scary, it is basically a lymphangiectasia. It's very much benign lesion, and it happens from a small 1 millimeter lesion size to this large. It has been seen, and it can be either observed or it can be excised. This kind of a lesion which we see commonly, and many times it has been misdiagnosed as the scleritis or the nodular scleritis. It's basically a slightly elevated pink mass, a smoke smell color appearance. Is nothing but what are you looking at is conjunctival lymphoma. You need to be very careful in such cases because there are high chances of patient converting into a systemic lymphoma in such cases. So early diagnosis of conjunctival lymphoma and the total systemic workup is very important in these cases. So to summarize, colors are very important clues to the diagnosis. Extent of the conjunctival lesions are important in view of biopsy, as we saw in cases of nevus. sites such as fornix, canthus, tarsal conjunctiva are basically red flag signs of atypical nature of the lesion, most likely malignant. So you see any lesions other than of the on the palpebral and bulbar conjunctiva, you need to be worried that what are you looking at might be a atypical lesion, and an incision biopsy is always indicated in such cases. Thank you. I acknowledge my mentor, Dr. Santosh Honavar, sir, and thank you all for patient listening. Over to you, Sonal.
Thank you, Sumit. That was a real good review of all the surface tumors. Till Swapnil sorts out his network issues at his end, I'd like to go ahead with my presentation next. So I'll be talking about decoding intraocular tumors. All right. So when talking about intraocular tumors, four main categories are to be taken into account: choroidal tumors, vitreoretinal tumors, RPE tumors, and optic nerve head tumors. Going ahead with choroidal tumors, the most common primary intraocular tumor, as we all know, is the choroidal melanoma. Though we get to see them less in our population as compared to the Caucasian race, we still have to be wary about their appearance as well as the early warning signs when we can catch them. Melanomas can be both melanotic as well as amelanotic. When dealing with a smaller size lesion, the tumor thickness of more than 2 mm, presence of orange pigment on top of it, easy in-office procedure of fundus autofluorescence checking can also help you differentiate the melanoma from benign choroidal nevus. Also, presence of subretinal fluid is alarming and suggestive of malignant activity. So what does orange pigment mean? So the tiny white structures on the top of it are the orange pigment, which are also, these are the lipofuscin deposits, which are also highlighted on fundus autofluorescence picture. Classically described, fundus fluorescent angiography will show you a double circulation, which basically means both the retinal vessels as well as intrinsic tumor vascularity in the choroidal melanoma get lit up during the angiography. That is the double circulation that you get. On ultrasound, they are classically moderate to low reflective because of the cohesive nature of the histopathological architecture of these tumors. The shape can be dome, mushroom, or diffuse configuration. As visible in this video, quite a little characteristic twinkling is seen when you perform a dynamic ultrasound on these patients. Mushroom configuration is always talked about when talking about choroidal melanoma, though I would leave with a note that this is not the most common configuration. The most common configuration is the dome shaped. However, how the mushroom shape is actually seen is when the choroidal melanoma breaches the Bruch's membrane and comes into the vitreous cavity. This is the appearance it gives, looking as a mushroom. OCT can also help you delineate and see for the SRF on top of the melanoma as well as the digit RP alteration that it has caused. When undetected at early stage, the choroidal melanoma can also have a bit of an extrascleral extension, as in this case. A great mimicker of choroidal melanoma in the mid-periphery or periphery is also choroidal hemorrhage, which is generally a week or two old. However, characteristic after movement, which we can catch on ultrasound, is characteristic of a choroidal hemorrhage. Moving on to the benign tumor, that's choroidal hemangioma, can be seen as a single circumscribed lesion as well as diffuse lesions in case of a Sturge-Weber syndrome. Characteristics include orange to red in color. They can be both diffuse or circumscribed. Subretinal fluid is kind of a norm, or if made to progress, they can also lead to a massive retinal detachment. Ultrasound classically shows high reflective lesion owing to its high vascularity. Fundus fluorescent angiography will give you early fluorescence in early phase, of course, patchy kind of a fluorescence in mid phase, as well as diffuse pattern in and persisting pattern in late phase. These are ancillary investigations are definitely conclusive of a choroidal hemangioma. OCT will help you look at the status of the fovea, if it is detached or not, and decide regarding the need for management for the same. Choroidal metastasis is an important differential diagnosis, particularly if you're looking at a patient with a prior history of a primary malignancy elsewhere in the body, or we are looking at something which is multifocal, present in both the eyes, without even without an evidence of a primary malignancy. They can have clear or turbid SRF along with retinal detachment with them. They are known to have rapid growth. Ultrasound V-scan, they can show variable internal reflectivity owing to the rapidly increasing cell volume. The common sites from where the malignancy can come into choroid is lung, breast, prostate, colon, kidney, and stomach. RP spicules as seen on fundus autofluorescence, as seen over here in this picture, is also characteristic of a choroidal metastasis. So this is a choroidal metastasis from lung carcinoma, lung adenocarcinoma. The starry sky pattern seen on the fundus fluorescence angiography over here in picture is also characteristic. The pattern is basically seen because of the RP clumping which has happened on top of the choroidal metastasis. Again, if not diagnosed very early, they can also go into secondary glaucoma, as in this case, which was retrospectively diagnosed as a malignancy of kidney. The close differential of metastasis in younger age group is choroidal granuloma. The granulomas tend to have an irregular surface. They can have accompanying vasculitis or retinal hemorrhages along with them. The frosty angiitis appearance seen on fundus fluorescence angiography can be of more clue. Most commonly, the etiology is tuberculosis based. So in our Indian subcontinent, we do have to be wary about these differentials. Choroidal osteoma is nothing but another benign tumor. However, is the only tumor which might have intrinsic vascularity apart from choroidal melanoma. They tend to have elevated lesions or scalloped edges. On ultrasound, by its virtue, because of the calcium deposit, will show orbital shadowing, which is kind of conclusive of this diagnosis. And fundus fluorescence angiography will show slow early phase filling and a persistent staining because of the calcium content of the lesion. A quick note about vitreoretinal tumors. So the most common primary intraocular tumor in childhood being retinoblastoma, the white retinal as well as vitreous involving tumors. Leukocoria is the most commonly encountered symptom. The tumor presents as an intraocular calcification seen on both ultrasound as well as CT scan. The close differential of leukocoria is a xanthocoria, which is actually a little bit of a yellow reflex seen in Coats disease. The stages of Coats disease are based upon the area where the telangiectasias and exudation is happening. Vitreoretinal lymphoma is another tumor which we have to be wary about. They do tend to mimic chronic posterior uveitis. So basically, any posterior uveitis which has not been responding as it should to the standard treatment regimen or multiple steroidal injections possibly can be actually a vitreoretinal lymphoma. Vitreoretinal biopsy and further flow cytometry evaluation is necessary for the diagnosis, and further CNS examination is mandated in such patients. Coming to RPE tumors, the characteristic of RPE tumors is basically they'll have a stuck-on appearance on the retina. The benign version, CHRP, is a congenital hypertrophy of RPE, can be solitary or multiple or syndrome related. They tend to give a blocked fluorescence owing to their epithelial origin. The RP is similarly the malignant variety of the RP tumors, RP adenocarcinoma, will also show a blocked fluorescence on fluorescence angiography. Along with it will probably show exudates in the rest of the subretina. A little bit about optic nerve head tumors. Optic nerve head melanocytoma is something that we do encounter quite frequently. So these are not malignant, very low potential of turning into malignancy. These tend to be benign lesions. However, owing to their location, they tend to have significant impact on the visual acuity. So perimetry will basically delineate, give you the visual field effects. Ultrasound will give you a dome-shaped lesion sitting on the top of the optic nerve head. Optic nerve head astrocytoma, many a times in association with one of the phacomorphic, one of the systemic phacomatosis. The characteristic has to be noted, the characteristic lesion. All right, so I would end my presentation over here. So I try to give a sorry, a small account of all the tumors quickly in 8 minutes. All right. Swapnil, are you okay with your connection? Can we have a couple of minutes of your presentation and we will move on to the pathology talk we are all waiting for?
Presentation. So, am I audible, ma'am?
Yes, you're audible, but we can't see your slides yet.
Yeah, now you can see. Oh. Okay, ma'am. We'll go ahead with pathology session, ma'am.
Sure. All right.
Still
So it gives me a great pleasure to invite Dr. Kaustav Mole, the consultant pathologist at Center for Sight Hospital, Hyderabad. He also heads the National Retinoblastoma Foundation. He'll be talking about the role of ocular pathology in managing ocular oncology cases. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Sonal. It's always a pleasure and a proud feeling, to see all of you grow and be a part of a session which all of you are running around. Thank you so much. Okay, so a lot of things have been covered by Aditi, Sumit, and Sonal, and I'm not going to make this some Greek and Latin to all of you. So I'm going to keep it very basic, and let's see, what is important as a clinician for you to know about pathology. So first thing first, let's see what are the samples that you need to send to a pathologist. Okay, when you're dealing with eyelid surgeries or eyelid biopsies, any chalazion presenting in a patient who's less than 40 years of age can be discarded. Then eyelid tissue removed during blepharoplasty or other cosmetic procedures, tissue removed during ectropion and entropion surgeries or eyelid shortening surgeries, all these can be discarded. Anything else, including chalasia, even if it's the first occurrence in a patient elder than 40 years of age, needs to be sent to a pathologist. Conjunctiva and cornea, all tissues, irrespective of the patient's age or your clinical suspicion, need to be sent to a pathologist. Trabecular meshwork, unless they are of research interest and you have discussed it with your pathologist, they don't have to be sent. Iris, ciliate, basically the uveal tract, anything that is removed during a glaucoma or cataract surgery can be discarded. Anything else needs to be sent to a pathologist. Similarly, lens tissue that is removed during cataract surgery could be discarded. Vitreous biopsies, I would personally recommend that all vitreous biopsies be sent to a pathologist. Epiretinal and subretinal, unless research interest, can be discarded. Any evisceration tissue, enucleation tissue has to be submitted to a pathologist irrespective of your clinical diagnosis. Now, when you're dealing with orbital tissues, only normal fat or bone that is removed during decompression or squint surgery can be discarded. All other tissues have to be sent to the lab. Lacrimal gland, all tissues again have to be sent to the lab. Lacrimal sac, if you're doing a dacryorhinocystectomy, then the bone tissue can be discarded, but the sac as such, irrespective of whether it's a DCT, DCR, whatever, it has to be sent to a pathologist. Same thing with orbital exenteration, cytology specimens, and other tissues, which are specifically removed for diagnosis, such as temporal artery. If you remove it, it's going to be for a clinical diagnosis, for a histopathological diagnosis. So all these need to be sent to a lab. Okay, now you have removed the tissue. How are you going to send it to the lab? First thing first, communicate with your pathologist. Communication is the key. Now, there was a very interesting thing which I noted in 2019. I was looking at all those communications that are made to me with respect to a specimen, either through fellows or through phone calls or emails or whatever. And what was the most common communication call that I got? Please expedite the report. Sonal is smiling. Okay, so anything that is of clinical urgency, please communicate to your pathologist. He wouldn't understand, what is urgent, what is not. Or if you can't communicate, please write it on a request form that so-and-so sample is urgent. Then if you are unsure of how to handle tissues, talk to a pathologist. For example, you all know how to handle orbital tissues, eyeballs, ocular surface lesions, but sometimes you might take out a muscle. So muscles need to be handled separately. So talk to your pathologist. They might need a different preservative. Again, non-routine handling of tissues, such as when you're dealing with frozen sections or you're going to take out tissue for electron microscopy, communicate to your pathologist. One, you will get to know how to send it. Second, he'll also be prepared, he or she will be prepared for the specimen to come and make prior arrangements if they are needed. The next thing to be done is a patient form or request form to be filled. So it should have all patient details, including his name, that basically demographic data and the MR number. The clinician's details need to be there because in case we need to communicate or ask something, we need to know where to contact. If there is a high risk status, such as if the patient is seropositive, these days if the patient was COVID positive, so we would be a little more careful in handling such tissues. The other details, you already know the location and orientation of the tissue. If there is any history of previous surgery, if there are any previous reports available, please attach it. And we are not going to copy the report, but we'll know what has been done. Then if there are any relevant imaging pictures or findings that you might want to share, please do that. This is a general request form that we have over here. So you can see there is everything that I just spoke about over here. Make sure you fill everything in detail. Don't write a very long case report like case history. We wouldn't understand half of it. Only mention what is important to us. Okay, now that you have filled, how to send a sample. Now let's look at few important samples or few common samples that are sent to a pathologist. Now, this obviously you would know that this is from an ocular surface. So when you remove a specimen or a lesion from an ocular surface, what you do is you spread it out on a Wattmann's filter paper, which has a diagram in which indicates the site or the orientation of this tissue. Once you put it on the filter paper, allow it to dry. Drying prevents rolling over of edges, and this helps the pathologist to sample the margins properly. Now, you can either send this sample this way, wherein you don't send the margin separately and the patient and the pathologist will sample them, or the second figure on your right top, you can send the margin separately and we will process them directly. Now, once the tissue has dried up, pick up the filter paper, put it in a polythene bag which has formalin, pack it, label it, and send it to your pathologist. Aditi just spoke to us about map biopsy. So if you have a map biopsy, draw a proper diagram, put tissues over there, again allow them to dry, and put the entire filter paper in a polythene bag which has formalin and send it across, so that when we'll process each of these separately and report on them separately. Now sometimes you might do a wide excision in a lid or orbit, so there you can use different types of sutures or sutures of different length so that we get to know how to orient it. Okay, now that you have packed it, how do you transport it? If there are multiple samples, it's always a good idea to place them in different containers, label them, and then send it to the lab. I will show you a picture of how to do it. The normal, in most cases, the formalin, the fixative that we use is a 10% neutral buffered formalin. The commercially available formalin is 40%. Please do not use that because it is very concentrated. It causes protein denaturation, and we cannot do subsequent ancillary tests after it, such as immunohistochemistry. If you want any special test, please discuss it with your pathologist beforehand. Now, if you are sending it to your lab, which is in the hospital, you can just put it in a container that contains formalin and send it. But if you want to transport it to a different lab which is far away, or to a lab which is in a different city, please follow IATA guidelines, which recommend that there should be 4 layers of packaging. The first layer can be your plastic container, like a bottle or something which has formalin in it. Around this has to be an absorbent material, something like cotton balls, paper towels, anything which can absorb in case there's a leakage. The third layer again has to be a container material such as plastic or polythene, which will again contain leakage. And the last one has to be a cardboard box. So and inside it has to be a declaration stating what the tissue is, what it is meant for, the sender's and the receiver's address and phone numbers, and then send it. If you're going to send unfixed specimens such as fresh tissues, please discuss it beforehand, like I've already told you. Okay, now these are pictures which show how to pack a specimen. Now the picture on your left is, you put a seal across the tissue or the tissue container. The other two pictures are where I told you, if there are different specimens, please put them in different containers. You mark them as H1, H2, H3, or superficial, deep, deeper, whatever, and then send it across. Okay, let's go through. I think we are in the last couple of slides. Now, there are certain situations which might necessitate different fixatives. So what do you need? Let's go through what are the fixatives that we can use. For, like I said, for most cases, 90% of the times, you would need 10% neutral buffered formalin. Commercial formalin, please dilute it to 10% and then add it. Buffered formalin is something that you can ask your pathologist to send it to you. Immunohistochemistry, if needed, again, it's the same preservative, same formalin. If you're going to send a bone marrow aspirate or bone marrow biopsy, bone marrow aspirate can be sent in EDTA tubes, which we use to collect blood, or you can use Heli's fluid. Bone marrow biopsy, because it has bone in it, you use Zenker's fluid. If you want electron microscopy, don't send it in formalin. Glutaraldehyde is the fixative of choice. If you're transporting vitreous biopsies, cassette fluids, or aqueous humor, add 1 or 2 drops of isopropyl alcohol, 95% alcohol, in a 1:5 ratio, seal the container, and then send it. Same thing for FNAC slides. If you're going to send tissue material for tissue cell blocks, use Boyne's fluid. All these can be procured from your lab. Okay, now, like I just said, I get a call for expedite the report. So I'm just going to prime you on, what are the turnaround times that you could, prepare yourself for. Routine samples, we usually take about 3 to 5 days. But if the tissues are small, if there is an urgency, and if you're pally with your pathologist, he might just do it in 24 to 48 hours. Frozen sections, expect about 15 to 20 minutes. But if you need something more urgent and, you decide, probably a frozen section was not planned, you decide to do something on the spot. There is something called intraoperative cytology. So that takes about 10 to 15 minutes. And like I said, small biopsies can be reported in 24 to 48 hours. Cytology, bone marrow, again, 48 to 72 hours. Immunohistochemistry usually takes a little longer because we have to go back and forth with different permutations and combinations. Now, Sonal, do we have time, or do I?
If you can summarize, because
okay, fine. So I think what to look for in a pathology report, we can cover it next time. All of them have covered the prognostic features that are important. So I think I'll just wrap it up now. Thank you, Sonal, once again, and thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Kaustubh. That was a really well summarized and very well put talk, and very practical points that all of us can take away from. And these are some things, as practical ocular oncologist, we would like to emphasize the role of ocular pathologist and communication with your ocular pathologist, because you're basically the whole line of management gets guided by the pathology report. So make sure you have a better transportation, better communication system, and better interpretation system as well. You can have well discussed sessions with your pathologist regarding any particular diagnosis. So with that, I'll conclude our IC. I'm sorry, I think we do not have much time to discuss any questions, but if any of you do have them, you can mail them to the organizers and they'll send them to us. We'll try to get back to you with the apt answers. All right, thank you, MOS, and thank you, organizing team, for giving us the chance. And thank you all the speakers for very crisp and apt presentations. With that, we'll take your leave. Thank you.